In this lesson, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the specular and diffuse attributes that are found on nearly all Maya light types. Okay, so picking up right where we left off in our previous lesson, we're going to continue working on this really simple little scene that we had set up. So let's go back to our point light, which is right up here. And let's press Control A on our keyboard to go back to the attribute editor for this. So what we're going to talk about in this lesson is the diffuse, specular, and the decay options. Okay, and we're actually going to start with the decay settings. So by default, we have our decay, which is always set to no decay. Now this is good for really simple illumination, but it's really not physically accurate. So in the real world, light will gradually start to get dimmer and dimmer as we start to get further away from our light source. So if you hold a light very, very close to an object, you get a lot of illumination. If you try to shine a flashlight onto something that is a mile away, you're not going to get any illumination at all reaching that area. Now, by default in Maya, that's not the way things work because we have our light set to no decay. So this light source that we have will actually reach all the way out to infinity and illuminate something that is 1,000 miles away. So, not very realistic. To fix that, we can start to introduce this decay, and there are actually several different types that we can start to choose from. So we have a basic linear decay, which is sort of the least amount of decay that we can start to apply. Now you'll notice right away as we start to introduce some sort of decay that our illumination almost entirely disappears. So whenever we start to introduce some level of decay, we always have to introduce a little bit higher intensity to compensate for that. So now bringing up our intensity, you can see now at a value of 10, we start to get now some illumination in this area, but you'll notice also that the illumination doesn't necessarily stretch all the way out to infinity. We actually start to get now some gradual fall off and gradual decay of our illumination, which is much more realistic. Now in this case, my slider stops at a value of 10. We can always overdrive these values. So we can come in here and type in, let's say a value of 20. There we go. Now we start to get a little bit brighter illumination, but we still have some nice gradual fall off. Okay, so that is our linear decay. We have also quadratic decay, which quadratic decay actually simulates the real world behavior of light. That starts to give us what we would call an inverse square fall off. So we could come in here now because we have a little bit more rapid decay with this quadratic. We're going to have to come in here and now bump up this intensity a little bit higher. So something like 50, 100, maybe 300. There we go. Now we're starting to get something a little bit better. So we start to get now, in this case, a much more kind of rapid fall off of our illumination. So we start to kind of have to be careful about introducing some of these really, really high decay rates into your scenes. And in this case, now scene scale starts to become really, really important. Because obviously an object that is a few centimeters away from your object is going to cast much more illumination than something that is several feet away or several meters away. So now the actual real world distance between your objects and the light source starts to become much, much more important. And we discuss a lot of these topics in a lot more detail in some of our more advanced lighting courses like Introduction to Lighting and Introduction to Mental Ray. So if you want to learn more about these topics in a lot more detail, definitely check out some of those courses. But for now, we just want to take a look at just sort of what some of these settings are and what they're responsible for. Now finally, we have this cubic fall off, which this is a much more rapid fall off. And actually this is faster than the way that light will decay in the real world. So the likelihood that you would ever use this is probably pretty small, but if you ever want maybe some sort of a little bit more of an artistic effect, maybe you really, really want this light to just be focused in a very, very small area, you do have that level of control if you want it or if you need it. Okay, so for now, I'm just going to set this maybe back to a linear mode, and let's maybe try to get that back to a manageable value. There we go, something like 20 on our intensity. I think it's going to look pretty good. Okay, now, talking about this decay rate, right up above here we have emit diffuse and emit specular. Now these two little check boxes are going to be found on almost all of your different light types, and they really refer to the two different types of illumination that each light can calculate. So we have diffuse, which is going to be your basic illumination. And then we also have this specular component. The specular component is what is responsible for this little shiny area and these little highlights that we start to see on our materials. So what's nice is we can start to have independent control over the specular and diffuse contribution. So let's say we take something like this light source, and with this light selected, I'm just going to duplicate this, Control D on my keyboard to duplicate. So now I have two light sources in here. Okay. Now let's maybe come in here, and I'm going to change this background color, maybe to just be a little bit darker, or maybe even a little bit brighter, just so that it's a little bit easier to see these light icons here. So we have our two light sources. Now, this can happen in a lot of scenes where you have maybe several different types of illumination or several different illumination sources throughout your scene. You can start to kind of overblow things with specular highlights. You can see now maybe we have maybe much brighter specularity than what we would want. So what we can do is let's say this light source over here, and just maybe differentiate this. We can give this maybe a little bit more of a blue color. There we go. So now we have sort of this white specular highlight and a blue specular highlight. So let's say now we want maybe this diffuse illumination maybe to be not present. So with this blue light we can turn off diffuse, and now we no longer have any light that's coming from this light source, as you can see here, but we do still have a specular highlight. So we can come in here and still kind of place a highlight wherever we want. This can be good, you know, if you have maybe your illumination that looks really, really good, but maybe you need just a little bit of extra highlight or a little bit of extra visual pop in an area. You can drop in a light, disable its diffuse emission, and now you can get a lot of control from this. Now the opposite is true if maybe we have our light set up, and like I mentioned, maybe we have maybe a little bit too much specularity coming from all these different lights that we have placed. I can go to something like my white light source, and let's tell it to just not emit diffuse. And you can see the difference right away. So with this, we still have the diffuse that's being emitted, but we've now disabled the specular component. So we still have the illumination that comes from this light, but no shininess or no highlights that are being calculated from this particular light source. Again, it gives us a lot of control to be able to come in here and fine-tune things, even though that may not be physically accurate, this result that we've set up. Sometimes what you want as an artist is more important than what may be physically accurate or physically realistic. You can push those boundaries a little bit more, and as long as you're careful about it, as long as you're tasteful about it, it can still come across as a beautiful, beautiful lighting setup. Okay, so that's a look at how we can start to control the diffuse and specular emission as well as the decay rate of all of our different Maya light types.